section.
Hi, I'd like to introduce my mom, Pat Soborowski. Could you please tell us about yourself, how old you are, where you were born?
Well, I was born in Chicago, Illinois, and I'm now 82 years old. I was born in July of 1933. I don't know what else to say.
Where were you when you found out about the war?
I had come home from church with my sister Lucille. We entered the living room, and Mom and Dad were clustered around the radio, listening to the news and telling us to be quiet. We knew that something was definitely up. As it turned out, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt who had announced the fact that Pearl Harbor had been invaded and that they were at war with Japan.
Who was living with you at that time?
My sister Lucille, my brother Phil, my mom and dad, and myself.
Did any of them have to fight in the war?
Yes, my brother-in-law, my sister Lucille's husband, and my brother Phil.
Were they drafted?
Yes, they were drafted. My brother Phil was just newlywed and was drafted shortly after and kind of split up the family. Things were all in a hubble, and naturally we were all very distressed. My sister Lucille at that time was engaged and later married, and her husband was also drafted and went into the service.
How did living change when the war started?
Living was somewhat drastic as far as our food consumption. We had blackouts. We had to close the drapes and worry about whether we were being invaded. We had flags that we put up on the windows that would announce whether we had someone in the service, and if it was gold, I believe it meant that they were dead, and if it was blue, they were serving in the service. We had rationed foods, and the rationing was the part that we all felt. We had to have stamps rationing foods, and you were allowed just so many stamps per a pound of sugar, a pound of butter. Your canned goods was rationed as far as there was a shortage on tin, and so things that were canned goods and stuff were difficult and hard to get. Uh, Butter, I recall that we had to use margarine. We couldn't get butter. Had to put the powder into the butter and stir it up, and that was what we used and got used to margarine, which to this day I do not want margarine. I like butter. So,
I know, I remember that. How was the workforce?
well, the workforce got to the point where you saw very few men. Most of the men that you saw were old or incapable of working or being drafted. And the women seemed to have taken over as far as many jobs because they had to support the families. And they also became workers that, like Rosie the Riveter, started with that, with the defense plants and working in factories developing ammunitions and whatever else was needed during the war.
Well, you were going to school at that time.
Yes, I was about 9 years old at the time, so some of my memories are that of a child and not really
Did you notice anything changing with any of the students or?
Yes. When I came to school, the fathers were gone. There was a lot of them that were uh, living with their mothers or their grandmothers, their aunts, their uncles. Many of the families had to live with another family member because of the fact that they couldn't afford to keep up the homes and whatever else that they had to do. I saw a little more blight. The children, I think, appeared to be more hard up, and I can recall that we, as children, played crazy games that were war games and what have you, and we knew not to go into what nationality they were, because if they were German, they were uh, discriminated against, so to speak, and everybody sort of kept it quiet, or they had possibly Jewish families or Poland. And of course, living in Chicago, there was a lot of Polish people, and there was a lot of Polish Jews, and a lot of German Jews, and Germans, of course. And the area that we lived was basically Polish and German. And so, of course, we had to really watch what we said as far as accusing one another. But I can still remember jumping over the lines to the cracks on the sidewalk and saying, you know, whatever it was, to miss a line, you killed a Jap. And so it was those silly things that, that we still managed to say. But
What about recreational?
movies mostly.
Do
At
any
that
of
time,
them
they
send-
used to have movies, and a lot of war movies were the popular thing at the time. Although there were movies that were supposed to try to get you off your mind of the war, and that's when I think that Wizard of Oz came out, and that I remember, and numerous of, I'm trying to think of touching Lassie Come Home, that kind of things that took you off from the war situation, but yet the war movies were very popular.
What about music?
Music, of course, was directed mostly that kind of introduced jazz. I don't remember that. It seemed like boogie woogie was the big thing, and we used to have. I lived in back of a park, and there was a dance that was held once a week, and my sister and her friends and all of them would go. I would be envious at the time, and we could hear the music being played at the time. And many of songs kind of remind me of that era. Like Elmer's Tune was one of my favorites, and all the war songs, of course. And it was one of those just between the movies and try to keep your mind off of things just in general. As life goes on today, it's not much different as far as what entertained you. We didn't have anything but radio, so that.
When the war ended, where were you and what were you doing?
I recall during that time I was a teenager, and I just remember that everybody was piling out of the house, screaming happily, and we ended up that night with a dance on the street, a street dance, everybody celebrating that the war had ended.
Well, thank you very much for the interview.
Dad, what are you watching?
Why did you do that? Everything was
I'm drooling.
I'm trying to delete.
the music, that stupid clock comes on. I'm like, oh, that's a distraction. And then just that was enough to tip me right off the edge.
We're gonna have to start all over again.
No, we're not. We're going to end it at that. I'm going to tell him it was a rough ending. Sorry. Too
The
many
stupid
people were
clock
there.
is my husband.
Yeah. It's still going.